Okay, so I think we will begin. Hold on one second. I have my papers with me. Okay, so I want to try to finish the topic of what we call Eid Echad Misayeya Patur Min Hashvua today, and I'll explain again where we are and what we're, trying to do. If you should still have the next week, hopefully we'll have new sources. For today, you should still have the sources from last week, which I will be making reference to. So the Gemara on Beis Omid Beis, talking about the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, one more time, just background, Shnayim Oksim Batalis, two people grab vying over the ownership of an object, each one claiming to be the exclusive sole owner. They're also physically holding on to it. So the language of the Mishnah was challenging to the Gemara. The Gemara says, Zeh Omar Ni Mitzasiya, Zeh Omar Ni Mitzasiya. This one says, I found it. The other one says, I found it. Zeh Omer Kula Shali, Zeh Omer Kula Shali. Each one says, the whole thing belongs to me. So the Gemara was troubled. What's the point of just, why do you need this double language? If each one said, I found it, then each one alone, then each one is essentially saying, that the whole thing belongs to him. So the Gemara's conclusion was that the Mishnah is speaking about two different cases. One case is a case of a mitzia. A mitzia means an object that was found, let's say, in a public place, and therefore, there is no owner, and therefore whoever picks it up and acquires it in a halachically appropriate fashion becomes the owner, and then the debate is who picked it up first, or did they pick it up together? That's the ani mitzasiya. But Zeh Omer Kula Shali, says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, is referring to a case of what we call Mekach Memkar. Mekach Memkar means that it was a sale, and the dispute is who is the real purchaser. So then the Gemara says on Beis Omid Beis, I don't understand if that's the issue. V'valeksi zuzi miman nokat. Why don't we just check and find out who gave the money, right? The person who gave the money likely is the real owner. So then the Gemara answers by saying that the nokat zuzi mitravayu, that actually the money was given by both parties. Each party put down money. But echad midaite echad bal korche. One was, accepted willingly, and he's the true owner. The other one, was trying to force his, way into ownership, and therefore we don't rely on the mocher, since it's a little bit of a complicated situation, and both people gave money. Therefore, the assumption is that the mocher is not capable of identifying the real owner after the fact. But the bigger question was, when the Gemara originally thought that there was only one person who gave the money, so the Gemara was saying, why don't we ask and rely on the mocher? And the problem is, why would you rely on the mocher? We have a rule that b'medvar mamurim bizman shemikcho biyado, avo bizman shein mikcho biyado, ein nemonim or hareu kekol adam, which really means that as long as the mocher is holding on to the object, meaning it's still in his possession, it hasn't, been transferred to the possession of the new owner. So then we do accord extra extra credibility to the mocher. But the second that the mocher is no longer in control, he loses that special stature, and therefore, since the case of our Mishnah, Zemer Kulashali is a case supposedly of Shnayim Oksim Batalis, so it's no longer in the hands of the mocher. So why did the Gemara say V'lechsi Zuzi Mimanaka, that we should ask the mocher? He has no greater, authority than any other person. So why are we asking him if he's not holding on to the object? So the answer of Rabbeinu Tam to that question, we talked about other answers and their implications last time. The answer of Rabbeinu Tam is very important. It is that the focal point of the Gemara is not the question of yachloku, meaning in the end of the day, there are two people vying for the object. We can't rely on the mocher decisively, to identify who the owner was. And therefore, either way, you're going to say yachloku, you're going to split the object between the two. But what the Gemara was concerned about was the other part of the Mishnah, which says that each party takes a shvuah, in this case a rabbinic shvuah, that he doesn't own less than half. So two things happen in the resolution of this case. One is we split the disputed object, and the other is that each one of them takes a shvuah drabanan. It's in that second, more minor aspect of the case that the Gemara says, "V'lechsi zuzi b'manokat." Why don't you believe the mocher to say what he says? Not believe him, and therefore it won't be achloku, but believe him, and therefore there'll be a biblical shvuah on the shekenegdo, on the person who he opposes, and there'll be an exemption of the shvuah drabanan, of the rabbinic oath, because eid echad misayeya is poter min hashvuah, because a supportive single aid has the ability to exempt the person he supports from giving a shvuah. So this is where Rabbeinu Tam came up with the sensational conclusion, which does not appear explicitly in any passage in the Talmud, other than this passage. If you read it this way, we spent last week time explaining that there are four other interpretations of this passage. So it's easy not to read the passage this way. But if you do read the passage this way, it becomes the single most authoritative source for what, either is a hidden law or a new law or a controversial law. And that is that a single witness can not only impose an oath on the person who he, accuses of lying, which we know already, that we know that halacha, but that a single witness also can exempt the person he supports from taking a shvuah. Okay, so that is a matter of huge controversy already in the medieval period, and it extends to the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. It's an enormously consequential but also controversial issue. So we began at the end of last week's shir just analyzing this argument, whether a single witness can exempt, from even a shvuah daraisa, from a biblical shvuah. And it's the famous debate there, again, in the world of Ashkenaz, this was mostly accepted. Rabbeinu, the big guns, if you want to call them, embrace this idea. Rabbeinu Tam, the Maram Rutenberg, the Rosh, these are the biggest authorities of the world of France and Germany. On the other hand, we talked about Provence, right? So the Ravid disagrees strongly. He thinks that it's not true that a single witness has the ability to exempt someone from a shua. And the Ramban, who is, the most significant of the halachists of, later Spain, we'll call it Christian Spain, he too disagrees very strongly. He thinks that a single aid can exempt someone from a shvuah drabanan, from a rabbinic oath, but not from a biblical oath. So I thought we would start with the.
Does this depend upon whether forcing somebody to make a shvuah is a more serious
Yes
thing, and therefore kal v'chomer, so to speak, you should be able to exempt him versus not?
That's part of the argument. That is part of the argument of the Rush, as we'll see in a moment, but we'll see that others dispute it.
But it's based on that theory that if you can force
if
somebody
you can
to
obligate somebody,
action, then a passive action should be surely able to do.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start with the Rush. So let's look at the Rush, because that's how he actually starts, and we'll go one by one. So let's look at the Rush. This is on page on the bottom of page 2. Everybody have that? Bottom of
Got it.
page 2 of the 4 pages.
Masechta Baba Metzia, Perek Aleph, Siman Gimel.
Excellent, exactly. So this is a very fascinating rush. Umidivra Rabbeinu Tam. Notice he didn't say that Rabbeinu Tam said this. He says Umidivre Rabbeinu Tam. From the words of Rabbeinu Tam, right? Yesh lilmod. We can derive, right? Deidachot poter min hashvua, that a single witness can exempt one from the obligation that that person has to take an oath. So notice he didn't say Rabbeinu Tam said that Eidachad is poter mishvua daraisa. He said, from what Rabbeinu Tam did say, we can surmise, right, that an Eidachad would be poter shvua even daraisa. Then he adds, Behavi Ram Mirutenberg, right? Rothenburg was a place in Germany. So Rab Meir Mirutenberg, known as the Maram Mirutenberg, brought a raya ledvarav midarshinan b'shavuos, because the Gemara says in Masachat Shavuos, lekol avon lekol chatas hu de'ein kam, avol kam le'inyan shvua. So that is a very interesting thing. The Gemara in Shavuos is actually talking about the opposite. They're talking about how do you know, or they're talking about an aspect of the obligation that an Eidachad triggers on the Kenegdo, on the person who he testifies against. That person has to take a Shvua Daraisa. So the Gemara says, how do you know that an Eidachad has the ability to impose on the other party a defensive Shvua Daraisa, a Nishba v'niftar, which makes him patur? How do you know that he has the ability to create that obligation? So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, "Lo yakim eidachad lekol avon lekol chatas," that a single aid doesn't have the ability to, impact a case of avon and chatas. What's avon and chatas? To bring a korban. I mean, to establish that a person did a ma'aseh avera, you need 2 witnesses. It's not enough to have 1 witness. And the diuk is aval kam le'inyan shvua. Aval kam le'inyan shvua. He does have impact with respect to the shvua. So that's a very interesting.
So this is not a svara. This is some kind of a gezeres akasiv, or it's a drush. What is this?
Well, this is a drasha. The diuk of the drasha, that's a drasha that the Gemara brings, which is that, an Eidachad can't be effective in oven and chatas, implying the drasha is that things that have a less rigorous standard than oven and chatas, he would be effective. So what is that? So the Gemara identified, maybe they have a Mesora, or maybe they're saying it Bisvara.
How would you classify this, as a smachta or what?
No, it's not. No, it's not a smachta. It's definitely a limud, but it's a it's a.
So it's higher than a svara, but lower than some kind of gezeres akasiv.
I mean, we treat it as exeris hakasiv because we're assuming that this is a correct reading of the pasuk. So it isn't just like my logic or some Tana or Amora's logic. This is cited as the definitive source for a very core principle.
And it doesn't fall into the category of contradicting the B'shuto Shel Mikra?
Well, no, it's not against
which a Jewish is not supposed to do.
Yeah, but this where's the contradiction to Pshuto Shel
Well,
Mikra?
if you read it straight, it says it's no good. 1/8 is no good for doing anything against the other guy.
No, it doesn't say that. It says a kolavan or kolchatas.
Yeah, I mean, but the reading is
I don't think that that's true. Meaning, if I were reading the pasuk and I read, 1 witness is insufficient, in the area of avon and chatas, it would at least be a 50% proposition for me to say, oh, but apparently he is effective in some other realm. And that's what they're saying. But what is fascinating is that the Gemara I'm going to read you the Gemara in Shavuos for a second, which I should have put here, but I didn't. Just give me 1 second. What is this Gemara really about? So the answer is the Gemara is not about if you notice the way the Maram Rutenberg and the Rush quoted, it sounds like Kom le'inyan shvua. I'm going to read the next line of the Rush for a minute. De lo miate kra, right? Bein lechiyu shvua, bein liptor mishvua. So this is already the Rush talking. The words of the Brisa in Masachet Shavuos are Kom le'inyan shvua, but he adds that pasuk didn't say anything about the direction, meaning the implication that it works for shua doesn't mention whether it works only for the chiyuv or even for the ptur. And therefore, in the absence of additional information, the assumption should be that it works for both. It works for the whole realm. It works for the whole category. But actually, where the Gemara in Shavuos is actually making this statement happens to be clearly in a context in which we're talking about the chiyuv shvua, not the ptur shvua. That doesn't mean that the drasha can't extend. But let me give the background because it's going to be important for our Modim Mixas Gemaras too. So it's very interesting. You know, when it comes to Modim Mixas, there are three I mentioned before. There are three shvuos d'oraisa, shvuos hadayanim, right? In civil courts, civil law courts. One is Eid Echad, single witness. He imposes a shvua on Kenegdo, on the person who he attacked. The other is shvuas hashomrim, meaning if I am entrusted to watch an object, right, and something happens to the object, and you have to take my word for the fact that something, I say, give me an object back. And you say, oh, you're shomer chinam, let's say, you're doing it for free. Say, somebody stole it from me. He's potter. But the owner doesn't know that that's true. So he has a right. That's the part of the law of Shvuas HaShomrim, is that the Shomer has to take a Shvua, Doraisa, to justify his claim. Or for example, if he was a Shomer Sachar, so the rule is that a Shomer Sachar is obligated in Geneva because he gets paid, so he has to up his level of Shmira, his threshold, right? But if it's an onus, if it's a flood or a fire or an earthquake or whatever it is, a lightning strike, so the Shomer Sachar is not liable for that. So he could take a shvua, but he has to take a shvua in order to establish it. Or even a shoel, who has the most liability, because as the Gemara puts it later on in Bava Metzia, kol hanoah shelo, he gets to use the object.
Except Mesa Machmas Malacha.
Yeah, but he still has the ptur of Mesa Machmas Malacha, very good, which makes a lot of sense. Meaning, if I give you permission to borrow the chayfetz, and in the context of properly borrowing it, we're not talking about overworking it or whatever, but you're working it according to customary and usual standards. It breaks down, so that's part of the permissibility that I had to use it. But how do we know that happened? The other fellow isn't there. We always say a shvuas hashomrim is typically a shvuas shema, a taina shema. Sorry. So we'll get back to it. But so the point is that you have to take a shvua d'oraisa. So that's the second shvua d'oraisa, and the third shvua d'oraisa is moed b'miktsas. Moed b'miktsas means that if I admit, it's like if someone accuses me, you owe me money you didn't pay me, right? So even if I deny the whole thing, I'm pater min Torah. That's called kofar hakol. But if I'm moed b'miktsas, if I say, you know what, you're partly correct, I do owe you some money, I just don't owe you the amount that you claim. That's called moed b'miktsas. He admits a part of it. Like, I say you owe me $100, and you say, no, I don't owe you 100. I owe you 30 or 70 or 50. It doesn't make a difference. So the rule in that case is moed b'miktsas is chayiv shvua d'oraisa, which means the part that he admits that he owes, he has to pay. The part that he denies, he has to take an oath, a biblical oath, clarifying or just reinforcing his claim that he is not liable. So the din of moed b'miktsas, there's an added special halacha. This is very important to know. And that is, there's a requirement of what we call shtei kesef, meaning, in most areas of civil law, like the minimum monetary amount is a pruta. Pruta is a very small amount. It's like a penny. Well, just compare. It's like a penny. Less than a penny, we don't consider serious money. Like the Mishnah says later on in Hazav, chamesh prutos hein, which means there are 5, issues that depend on the status of pruta. You can be mekadosh and isha with the pruta. The hoda of a moed b'miktsas can be with the pruta, as we'll explain. The Gemara the Mishnah has a broader idea even. Ein bezdin niskakin b'pachos mishava pruta, meaning the courts don't bother, literally, if the amount is less than a pruta. By the way, if the amount is a pruta, they
have to go to small claims court.
Yeah, it's small claims court, but there's something even too small for small claims court. Although, just to make it clear, we say, din pruta kedin mea, meaning everybody has a right to their
justice.
Everybody's rights should be protected. And there's no, as long as it's within the Rubicon of money, it doesn't matter if it's $1 million or it's a pruta. You have no right to take my money. I have no right to take your money. So that's what the Gemara says, din pruta kedin mea, meaning the rules that apply to a pruta. It sounds strange, right? Apply this. What applies to $100 applies to a penny. What applies to $1 million, applies to $100. Meaning, it's the right of ownership.
There is no shear for gezela. There's no shear for gezela.
There is pruta.
So then maybe that's also the reason that if the one is taking it from the other, if it's less than a pruta, then it doesn't fit the.
Okay, could be. By the way, I should add that there is an iser, even gezel and geneva less than a pruta, but whether that's darbanan or daraisa, or maybe it's even daraisa, but it's a kind of what we call chatzi shir, and for ben Noach, for non-Jew, their gezel extends to less than a pruta. Chazal say about the Jews, hopefully they're right. Well, we know they're right in the bigger picture. Hopefully we live up to it in the smaller picture. That we're Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, that we have a good heart, and that we empathize with people, and that we are like we're the b'nei Avraham Avinu. We're Rachmanus and Chesed. Hopefully, is part of our spiritual and maybe even physical, definitely halachic DNA. So Chazal say that that's the reason why, our Rubicon in terms of, financial, consequential, quantity, is a pruta. Like any less than a pruta, Klal Yisrael mochala. Whereas non-Jews, they say, oh, they're achzarim. They're like, they stand up for, any little, right that they have. They refuse to relent or relinquish, or, to have a little bit of additional rachmanos. Obviously, it's a broad, statement. There are many non-Jews who are rachmanim, and there are many Jews who, could use more rachmanos. But as a nation, in terms of what we should be, inspired by the Dinei Torah and the role models of the Avos and many others, we should be Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. So anyway, why am I telling you this? So normally for most dinim, pruta is the minimum. However, there's a special halacha, Gzeres HaKasuv, and that is that when it comes to moed b'miktsas, there's a concept of shtei kesef, which means pruta isn't enough. It's called tu ma'ah. The amount isn't so significant right at the moment. There's a debate between Rav and Shmuel whether the two kesef, shtei kesef, is the minimum for the taina, for the claim, or for the kfira, for the amount that you deny. But there's a special din in moed b'miktsas, even though the hoda'ah, the amount you have to admit, is enough that it's a pruta, but possibly the kfira, the amount that you deny, or the bigger taina, has to be shtei kesef. So the Gemara in Masachet Shavuos says the following, and this is the background for the statement that the Rosh is quoting. And then it goes as follows. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Shmuel. Lo shanu
No, it's good.
ela b'tainas malveh,
Right.
v'hodas loveh.
Aval all right, we got other things we got to finish up. But I'm going to go back to Shir. What did you tend to Shir was like 7 to 10 or something like that?
Yeah, everybody got that?
Did Deborah say that in the car? Whatever, it doesn't really matter.
I think we're,
Is Deborah going or she's
so basically,
okay.
What are we trying to say?
All right.
When it comes to Moed B'Miktzah, there is a special shiur of
tonight. I'll see you in the morning.
But when it comes to Eid Echad, there's no shiur whatsoever.
Okay.
So the Gemara says, how do you know this?
Knicks are
how
not
do you
on
know
tonight,
that
right?
Eid Echad doesn't have a shiur?
Okay,
so
where they
says, my kaima,
got it. So that game is going to be on already or soon or something. Okay. Very good for Toodaloo. I love you.
So it's here where the Gemara makes its statement that this is the only place in Shas where the Gemara establishes that Eid Echad is Mechaya B'Shvua, based on this derivation. But what is it referring to? Ptur or Chiyuv Shvua? Chiyuv Shvua. Right? Then the next line in the Gemara is equally significant. The Gemara says, V'tanya, Kol mokom sheshnayim mechayben osamamon, Eid Echad mechaybo Shvua. Whenever two witnesses have the ability, right, to demand, to impose an obligation of mammon, which two witnesses can do because they are the apex of proof, right? Eid Echad mechaybo Shvua. A single aid can, in parallel, impose a shvua. Notice, mechayev shvua doesn't say, kol mokom sheshnayim potrinis amamon eid echad poter min hashvua.
But maybe
what I want to show you is that
that's self-understood from the more aggressive approach of
right. Okay, that if that's true, I'm just trying to show the following, and then like when you have in any argumentation, any legal argumentation, or any kind of argumentation, right? When you bring a proof for something, or there's a source, you want to be very careful, to appreciate and understand exactly what it says. So what I'm trying to say is the source that the Rosh quotes in context and in language is actually very specifically referring to the koach of an Eid Echad to obligate a shvua d'oraisa al shekenegdo on the person that he imposes.
and
The Rosh is actually, therefore, in a more defensive position. His defensive position, though, is also rooted in something. Two things. Number one, the limud doesn't take stand one way or another, whether it's Talmud Chiyuv or Ptur. It only says, "Come hu l'shvua," as opposed to "Come hu l'kol chatas u'l'kol avon." The word "come hu" per se is neutral, even though the application in the Gemara happens to be, both in context and in the following, the subsequent statement is Chiyuv Shvua. Nonetheless, the words "Kam hu l'shvua," "Kam hu la'avon," etc., in theory, could refer to a broader categorical impact. That's number one. And number two is what you're saying, which is, that's why the Rosh introduces, now let's go back to the Rosh for a minute, a kal v'chomer. So the Rosh says, because he realizes, the first thing he says is, Aval kam hu l'inyan shvua, this is two lines up from the bottom of the page, Aval kam l'inyan shvua, dilo miate kra, bein l'chiyuv shvua, bein li pater mi shvua. Why does the Rosh need to add these words? Because he knows very well, he knows better than we do, right, that the context of the Gemara isn't going to help him. The Gemara is using this to prove Chiyuv Shvua. But the method of proving Chiyuv Shvua, says the Rosh, is one which is neutral in this application. And therefore, even though the Gemara itself is employing, right, ein echad in one direction, right, the source upon which it draws can be understood, or maybe should be understood according to the Rosh, in a broader, more neutral way. But since he was, a master at all this, so he understood that maybe somebody will say, well, how do you know? And we'll see in a moment, the Ramban basically quotes exactly the same thing and basically says the opposite, as we'll see. Just a minute. So that's why he adds the next line, which is what you've been hinting at, which is V'od kal v'chomer. Says the Rosh, there's a kal v'chomer here. And that is Eza Koach Meruba. Who's in a stronger position, right? Legally, says the Rosh, Koach HaMuchsak or Koach She'ein Muchsak. Is it the person who is a Muchsak, the Nitva, in other words, the person whose financial position we are upholding, or is it the Toveya? Who's in a stronger position, the Toveya or the Nitva? Well, the answer is we say Motzin Bekarel of Araya, right? So obviously the Nitva's position is strong. I mean, the burden of proof is to take away from the Nitva. Correct?
How about the chazaka that by a shomer anyway, there's a chazaka that he gave him something, so maybe that should have some impact.
In which direction, though?
Of the toveya. In other words, I give you something to watch. Okay, yeah. So the chazaka is that I gave it to you. It was real. You had it.
I see. No, yeah, no, right. No, I hear what you're saying. We're going to get to that. That so also says that, but that's the principle. Any day imis chayavti or any day in praticha, we call it. But no, but that's a little different because there really is that. Meaning, the object belonged to the owner, and he gave it to the shomer, who defaults right now, is obligated to return it to him. So the burden of proof is on him to explain why he's not returning the object. But in the case of a toveya and a nitva, the nitva is claiming that the toveya is lying. So the muchzak is always the nitva; it's always the defendant. So the Rosh is making the argument. He's saying it's almost like he's saying, number one, right? The source of Eid Echad is a neutral one, even though the application in the Gemara is in the direction of Chiyuv, the source itself is neutral. Number two, if it's neutral, there's good reason to think, and even if it wasn't neutral, there's good reason to think that there's a Kal V'chomer. In other words, even if we know that the Gemara is speaking about L'chiyuv, if you can be Mechayiv Shvuah, you can certainly be Poter Shvuah. Why is that? The answer is, according to the Rosh, because in one case you're supporting the muchzak, and supporting the muchzak means you're supporting the stronger party. In the other case, you are attacking the muchzak. So it's easier to support him than attack him if his position is preferable, if his position is stronger. Correct? What's the flaw with that argument? Because it's not always a question of who you are assisting. There may be another dynamic in that maybe it's easier to obligate someone to clarify something, which is what a shvuah is, right, than it is to exempt him once he's already obligated. Once he's obligated to clarify, maybe that balloons, into maybe then now the clarification, is his ticket for exemption. Meaning, what the Rosh is ignoring, and this is what the Rashbats, who was an important figure, he wrote the tshuvas known as the Tashbates, the tshuvas of the Rashbats. So he was a very important, late 14th century, early 15th century figure, the contemporary of the Rivash. He had many exchanges with the Rivash. This is Spain of that era. So he makes the argument, it's quoted in Shittim Gobetzes, he says the issue is not who you're supporting and who you're attacking. The issue is the quality. What does it take to create a shvuah, and what does it take to exempt the shvuah? That's the issue. So the reason it's easy to create a shvua because, you're just asking for a clarification. The reason that there's no shvua until you ask for it is because there's no basis for it. Once you ask for clarification, why not? But once a person is obligated to clarify, right, then to exempt him from that, may require heavier lifting.
But why is he obligated at all? In other words, who says one aid will obligate him at all?
No, well, that's
sort of circular reasoning a little bit. In other words,
we definitely know from the Gemara.
Trying to figure out the power of the Eid Echad.
Right, but from the Gemara we know that the limud is being used at l'chiyuv. We know that for two reasons. Number one, the whole point is to explain why you don't need shtei kesef in Eid Echad, where you do need it in Moed b'miktzas. That's talking about the chiyuv hashvua. Number two, the continued parallel that the Gemara quotes is kol sheshnayim mechayvin osamamon Eid Echad mechayiv shvua. So both the impetus of bringing the makar and the kind of summation or the transformation of the makar into a klal, into a legal principle, both highlight the chiyuv shvua part. So the question then becomes, okay, good. We know that chiyuv shvua Eid Echad, that's a no-brainer. That we know is true. So I'm going to show you in a second. Ramban says that's all we know, and we don't know anything more, and therefore you have no right. You have no right to extend that chiddush. And the Rosh says, of course you have the right, because number one, the makar itself doesn't take a clear position on the direction. And even if the Gemara, is clear evidence that it goes in at least that other direction, there's a kavachomer that says, well, then certainly it goes the other way. But the kavachomer is based on who you are.
But don't we generally
who you are supporting, not objectively on the question whether it's easier to exempt or it is to obligate. I'll give you another example, just very quickly. In the world of Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim, right? We have a rule that a single aid is believed in matters of Yisurim. That is an edus. That's called nemanus, belief. If somebody says this is kosher food, normally we believe him. If he says it's not kosher food, we believe him. However, there's an interesting argument among the Rishonim that goes as follows. Maybe we should distinguish between Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim Le'asor and Lahatir. The only problem is that the argument, is also an argument which is better, which is worse. There are some Rishonim who think that just because Eid Echad is Neman to be Matir doesn't mean it's Neman to be Oser. And others take exactly the opposite position. It might be Neman Le'asor, but it's not Neman Lahatir. So I'm just giving you this as the same kind of example. In other words, sometimes you think, well, I'm in a neutral state. You want to create an obligation.
But don't we have a general rule, that somebody's possession requires a very strong something or other. Okay?
Right.
So clearly, just to leave it that he doesn't have to do something, it should be less stringent, logically.
Right, but what you're ignoring is the fact that he's already obligated. The obligation itself changes the equation. That's what the Rashbat is saying. Rashbat says, listen, if there's no obligation, it might be easier to initiate one. But if you have an obligation, that's that has a life of its own, then ignoring that obligation requires greater justification.
So even though we understand that if there's no obligation, then to take money from somebody is more difficult. But right. If there is no obligation, then we would say we don't know which is more difficult. That's
no. What I'm saying is more specifically. I'm talking about a shvua very specifically. A shvua is a birur. It's a clarification. So what we're saying is, if there are no problems, there's no reason to demand clarification. If there's
there definitely is a problem here. Do people?
No. What I'm saying is, you're not wrong, because what you're saying is like the rush. But what I'm saying, what you're missing is that the equation between being motzi or mechayev mamon, right, and being mechayev or poter a shvua has a very important flaw, and that is that when you want to take money from someone, right, or you want to impose money upon someone, it's clear that the burden of proof is on you, because that's always a radical. It's easier to say that leave the status quo and and don't do anything than it is to say, oh, raid his bank account, take his money. However, when you're talking about a shvua, what you're really talking about on one level is clarification. I'm saying, you know what? I would want, you're not asking for money. You're asking him to bolster his nemonus.
But you're doing that because an aide got up and said that he's wrong.
Right. But
it's not a complete two shemos, one against the other or something.
No, because if there's no reason, then there's no reason to attack anybody's credibility. But the point is, it may not take so much.
Credibility is already impacted by the aide who's swearing that this guy is lying. When an aide echad comes, he's going to...
That's the point. The aide echad says, you're lying. And therefore we're saying, you know what? It wouldn't hurt for you to take a shvua and to clarify your position. What's the downside? We just want you to tell the truth. But if we have a good reason for you to tell the truth, right, then why should we so easily let you off the hook from taking the shvua? What I'm saying is, to take money out of your account, is one thing. To ask you, to either clarify or to substantiate your statement in a way that doesn't cost you anything, that might be a far less, request. And on the contrary, once the request is made, to say, oh, you know what? You don't have to clarify. That might require, once you do have the obligation to clarify, ignoring it and not clarifying kind of leaves, a bad taste or a suffix. So what I'm saying is, if you were just measuring, this is what logic is about. This is what argumentation is about. You're trying, people debate, like they're trying to highlight, what is the salient, point, especially if there's a complicated, discussion. So this is a great example of that. What we're saying is, if you were looking at this problem from the perspective of supporting the toveya or supporting the nitva, and you were looking at it with, from the lens of dine mominus, what you would say was that it's easier to support the nitva than it is to support the toveya. And that would lead you to think, in the case of shvua, that if you can be mechayev a shvua, you can certainly be poter shvua. However, what the other side of the argument is that how can you compare money, which is about, gain and loss and ownership and losing ownership, with the demand, just to clarify, what happened. I want a birur in Bezdin. Right? So from that point of view, it's probably easier to trigger, well, it is technically easier, but even in a parallel way, it's easier to trigger the obligation to clarify than it is to get you off the hook once there was a good reason for you to clarify. And from that point of view, right, the kal v'chomer is wrong. Okay. Just to show you that other people don't agree with this kal v'chomer and whatever. So just look for a minute at the Ramban in Milchamas Hashem. I don't want to go into the Balamor now because that'll be a little complicated. I want to get into some other part instead. So go down, as you have Milchamas Hashem on top of page 4.
Hashem.
Great. So now go down. It says Milchamas Hashem, Masechet Bava Metzia, Daf Aleph, Amud Aleph, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So now go down 5 lines. In the middle of the 5th line, you'll see the words Aval Bal HaMaor. You have that? Zal. 5 lines down in the middle of the line. Aval, it's a Rashi Tevos. It's base ayin hey, smidget mem, right? Aval Balamor Zal, Kilkel Devarav. The Ramban, accuses the Balamor of corrupting. He brings Rabbeinu Tam, this idea that Eidachel Messiah is Pater Min HaShavua, but he brings it in such a way that the Ramban thinks that he corrupted it, meaning that he misconstrued it and that he's presenting it in a way that is inaccurate, right, imprecise. So he says, Aval Balamor Kilkel Devarav. Balamor, corrupted Rabbeinu Tam's position. The Pnei Rayosov Shehevi Midasumchas, I'm going to leave that out for the moment. The proof that he brought, Umishmaitza Delakama, the 2 proofs that he brought for Rabbeinu Tam, prove that he understood Lefishanir Midvarav Dafilu Shvua Doraisa Kagomboda B'Mitzas Shvuas Hashomrim Poter Eid Echad V'Zedavar She'i Afshar. Exactly the opposite. So the Ramban says it seems from the way Balamor is reading Rabbeinu Tam that he is implying that Rabbeinu Tam applied this idea that a support of Eid Echad exempts from a Shua as well, and that is simply impossible. Okay? Why? So listen to the reason. You're expecting some big proof now, right? Like, it's a big statement to say it's impossible and that the Balamor is Mekalkel, that he's corrupting. What's the proof? What's the strong evidence? The lo ashkechan Eid Echad come. Notice the language Eid Echad come, because that's what the Gemara says in Shavuos, right? Aval come hu l'shvua, not lo avon l'chatas. Says Ramban, yeah, but the case, I'm adding a little bit. The case in the Gemara, where it says which motivated it to bring that source.
What?
And then the principle that ensues is only a case of Elalachayev Shua. Avalo liftar, not to exempt. Meaning,
I had it before.
Even though the words Kamhu Lishvua could have been
Everyone, please go on mute
Broadway,
except the
but
rabbi.
the Indian of a
Go on mute.
Shavua,
Okay.
nonetheless,
Where's my pink?
we have to
The pink was my universal. I
mute a
wish
little
you would
bit.
give it back to me.
Okay, if I can find
Nonetheless,
it, I can get it back to you.
the logic, says
This
the
feels like any book
Ramban,
that'll fit
is
this.
that you cannot extend beyond Shvua Seid Echad, Chiyuv Shvua, without
Okay.
absolute evidence.
Like this?
What?
Efshar de lo ashkechon Eid Echad kama l'kayiv Shvua, avalo liftor.
Are you going to the Apple store again?
Then he has another
answer?
raya.
No.
I might
But
have to ask you to
before we
stop
get
in
to
and
the
What
finish
if
raya,
you
saying
go
God.
on mute?
is
I
that
feel this is a futile mission. It's going to take me 1 minute to say no.
Ramban,
But what?
assuming against the rush,
But I would love you to
Andy,
answer
I'm
whether
on
you
it.
can take this
Andy, I'm on it.
13
but it doesn't go in
and turn
both
it into a
Excuse me,
13 for me at no
Ezra.
charge.
Ezra, would you please mute your microphone? We're all hearing you.
Sorry. Go ahead.
right? So basically, we implicitly in the Ramban, and it's more powerful because he doesn't even feel like he needs to expand on it. The Ramban is saying, if the evidence is only for a chiyuv shua seid echad, ein lecha ba'al kedusha. Now, what motivates this argument?
Now the Rosh read the Ramban.
Yes, and you're going to see in a moment that
But he came afterwards, so he read the Ramban.
Yes, and you'll see in a moment how the extent to which he read the Ramban, because he's going to respond to the Ramban's strongest proof in a way that is a little bit sharp in its own right, just like the Ramban was sharp with the Balamar, right? The Rush is going to be sharp with the Ramban, and what's going to emerge, though, is going to be a really interesting argument. But before we get to there, what accounts for the differing mentalities of the Rush and the Ramban? The same evidence, the word Kamal Shvua, right? being a kind of neutral, the Ramban saying the language is neutral and therefore you can't extend it beyond what we know it minimally is.
Depends on the
And the Rosh is saying the language is neutral, and even before he gets to the Kal V'chomer, and therefore why wouldn't you extend it completely? So I'll tell you what I think the argument is. Very simple, but very profound, and that is, to what extent is Eid Echad in the realm of Shvuah really an outgrowth and an extension of Shnayim Eidim in Mammon? In other words, how much, again, the Gemara has this klal.
Are we saying, is he less than 2, a little bit less than 2, or is he a little bit more than nothing? Is that the argument?
Well, you could say it that way. That's a quantitative way to say it, but it works. So basically what I'm saying is, or maybe a better way to say it would be, this is like,
Well, by Yavamas, I thought we give him a kayach like 2. Eid Echad by Nisha, like she's with the aid, right? Can we say that by Yavamas?
With the aid, but we'll discuss that.
No. We say she'll look into it. I thought we said that.
Oh, Isha Daiko Mitzvah, you mean?
Yeah,
but that's a separate category. Eid Echad, we'll get to that. But Egla Rufa, Sota, and Misa Sabal, which is what you're talking about. Misa Sabal is the the issue of Aguna. Those are like an in-between category. But you know what? It's good that you bring it up.
Because the consequences are so great that we think the people will be more...
Yeah, but it's good that you brought it up because in the hierarchy, it's actually very relevant. So you have like this. At the apex, we'll say like this. At the apex of the world of belief,
testimony,
proof, testimony, is two witnesses that testify. And as I've said many times, we treat them like, they're bearing
gold standard.
The gold standard, and they're even factual. They're not just, reliable, very, likely to be telling the truth. They're telling the truth, vadai, until we know otherwise. Then you have something called Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, which is also, but we don't call that Eidus, we call it Nemanus. It's a lower level. It means they have credibility. We believe them. We rely on them. We don't rely on them and think it's fact. We rely on them because we rely on them. And therefore, it's only Isurim, maybe only Leisur, maybe only Leheter, as we discussed before. That's Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, right? Now, Jacob is making a correct point, and that is an in-between category where we believe in Eid Echad, we say Kol Makom Shehemina HaTorah Eid Echad Harei Kan Shnayim, that we treat an Eid Echad as if he's 2. We're going to get to this in the Ran. If we don't get to it today, we'll finish with this next week. But it's going to be very relevant. But what it means is as follows. Let's say Eid Echad b'misabal, like you said. Let's say an Aguna case. So an Eid Echad comes and he says, I can attest to the fact, that her husband, is no longer living. I saw him, fall into Mayim She'lem Sof. He fell in the middle of the ocean, and there were no boats there, and we waited enough time that no one bobbed up. So Eid Echad b'misa sabah. So the Gemara says that this is a statement of Ula. Kol makom she'atorah hemina Eid Echad. This is also true about Egla Rufa, and it's true about Sota. Kol makom she'mina Torah Eid Echad harei kan shnayim. Mainly, if he came and he wasn't contradicted right away by another aid, it's what's called bezeh achar. Even if another aid came later on, but after this testimony was already accepted, we accord higher level of credibility in these 3 areas to the Eid Echad, such that they can't be contradicted by another Eid Echad, as we'll discuss, unless it's bevasachas, unless they both come together. Now, I should make it clear, it's a little bit misleading, the statement of Ula. Because again, what does the statement say? Kol makom she'mina Torah Eid Echad harei kan shnayim. Well, let's say actually Shnayim come and they contradict. Let's say 2 Eidim come to court, bezeh achar zeh, let's say a week later, a month later, 10 years later, it doesn't make a difference, and they contradict the words of the Eid Echad, who couldn't be contradicted by another Eid Echad alone because of the rule of Ula. So if you were to take literally the statement, you'd say, oh, it's trey or trey. You'd say, oh, it's like, 2 against 2. But it's not. The din of Ula does not allow, the din of Ula allows the superiority of the first state Echad vis-a-vis a counterpart, but it does not allow the equal status of the Seid Echad to 2 real Eidim. So that's a way of establishing.
In a vacuum, he's treated like 2 Eidim.
Yeah, exactly.
And not just in a vacuum. How about the category of a Dos Baldin?
By the way, not just in a vacuum, because even if an equal Eid Echad were to come, but B'zach Harzeh, even then.
But how about in another category of a Dos Baldin, but in a Mama?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that when we get to Bava Metzia. But that's called, Hodos Baldin, Eschayvus, Namanus. No, that's a category too. Very important. But the bigger point I want to make is as follows. So you have Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. Then you have like these special categories called, Misa Sabal, Egla Rufa, Sota. And, there are a number of differences. I don't want to get into it right now. Then you have, let's say, Eid Echad B'Shvua. Right? And then you have Shnayim Eidim B'Momon. So the question is Eid Echad B'Shvua like a super Egla Rufa, Misa Sabal, Sota? But it still belongs in the world mostly of Namanus? Or is it just a lesser, Shnayim Eidim? I mean, how seriously, when the Gemara says Vitanya, Kol Mokom Sheshnayim B'Chayv Nosamom Eid Echad B'Chayv Shvua, right? How is that just like a mnemonic device to tell you broadly, that mostly there's this parallel, or is it the Gemara's way of saying Eid Echad is just a little under, Shnayim Eidim, but it belongs to the world of Eidos, not to the world even of super Nemos.
By using the litmus of Zimun, since there's no Zimun by Eid Echad, so that means that he doesn't fit into the category of
Hazama. Well, so we'll get to Hazama. And part of this plays out on the Gemara on Gimel Amud Beis and Daled Amud Aleph, which we're going to get to in a few weeks, where they do discuss.
I mean, if he's not responsible to be held accountable for Zimun, Hazama,
yeah,
then he shouldn't be.
And that's Hazama is such a big chiddush. Well, we'll discuss it. Okay. I mean, it happens to be lines in the Gemara. If you want to see, just for a second. If you look at the Gemara in Shavua, in Bava Metzia, just for a minute, you'll see this is the discussion on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Those who have a Gemara, if you want to look at it for a minute, and then I want to get back to the Rosh and the Ramban. There's some other very critical issue before we end off tonight that I want to finish off so we can finish next week. But if you look at the Gemara in Daf Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara talks about Rabbi, Kamais. I don't want to get into it right now. But if you wanted to see the lines in the Gemara that talk about it, so because you're raising it, so look at the bottom, look at the Gimel Amud Beis, and go up 3, 6, 7 lines from the bottom of the page, the last 2 words. The Gemara says, "Elamala piv shekain eina b'achasha ubahazama." Right? That's relevant to what you're asking. Tomar be'edim sheyeshnon b'achasha ubahazama. The Gemara is weighing, so the Gemara says, "Ela asya meid echad, meid echad shem b'chayva mamon." Then later on, if you look on Daled Amud Aleph, the end of this Shaklavataria, which we will discuss, the Gemara says, "Malatzad shavom shava shabahen," meaning of Hodas Baldin and Eid Echad, Shekain Eina B'Toras Hazama, Tomar Be'edim Sheeshon Hazama. The Gemara says, Holo Kasher, B'chia Toras Hazama Lo Parich. So that's what I said to you a minute ago. Toras Hazama Lo Parich. So it's a discussion in the Gemara. We'll discuss the details when we get there of, what kind of impact does the special din of Hazama and Shnayim Eidim have on this whole, perspective.
That is.
But before we get to that, so let's go back to where we were for a moment. So what I'm trying to say is like this. The Rosh, Maram Rittenberg, B'Shem Rabbeinu Tam, what they were saying was, listen, Eid Echad isn't Mechayiv Mamon, but it belongs to the world of Eidim. And it is to Shvua what Eidim is to Mamon. And if you take that literally and you think that that is true, then there's absolutely no reason to think Kamhu L'Shvua doesn't mean Bein L'Chiyuv, Bein L'Ptur, because in the world of Shnayim Eidim, it's Bein L'Chiyuv, Bein L'Ptur. If two Eidim come and they testify that someone is obligated, they're obligated. And if they come and they testify that two people are exempt, they're exempt. So if you really think there's a total parallel, and the reason for the parallel is that Eid Echad, is in the category of Eidos, just on a lower level, but qualitatively it belongs to that world. So then why should you, as long as you know that they work in the realm of Shvua in the same way that Mammon works in the realm of I'm sorry, that Eidim works in the realm of Mammon, then you don't need additional information. You don't need to justify. There's no pressure for you to have to prove Bein L'Chiyuv, Bein L'Ptur. There's no Bein L'Chiyuv, Bein L'Ptur in Eidim, in Mammon, so there's no Bein L'Chiyuv, Bein L'Ptur in Eid Echad L'Gabe Shvua. However, maybe the Ramban thinks that that's just not correct. Maybe the Ramban thinks that, a little bit like what you were saying, L'Kol Avon L'Kol Chatos, is a wide category. It doesn't work for Mammon, doesn't work for the Fashos, doesn't work for Avon, doesn't work for Chatos. And the Gemara is saying, it works for Shvua. Meaning, the Chiddush is that even though it's not Eidos, and even though it's just like a super, Egla Rufa, Misa Sabal, Sota, Eid Echad, it's a super Nemanus, we'll call it, that nonetheless it works for Shua. But all we know is that it works for Chiyuv Shvua.
But even though it works for Shvua,
we shouldn't assume
how much power it has to work for Shvua. What I think the Ramban is saying is that we can't equate the power factor, say
exactly.
that just like Eidos has certain power.
Now, again, if he were responding to the Rosh's Kal V'chomer, I think he'd have to say something like the Rashbats, like we said before. That's why it's such a fascinating window, because these are complicated questions. Like, that's why I say good debating is like, knowing what to, zero in on. What's the common and what's the consequential, feature. There are always common threads and there are always differences, right? The art, and especially if you're not just arguing, you're really trying to, figure out what the truth is. The art is to figure out, which are the consequential, common denominators and which are the consequential, distinguishers.
Is an Ashkenaz for the argument?
What?
Is an Ashkenaz for the argument?
It is, but I don't think it had to be.
But I mean, does it have roots in deeper roots in Ashkenaz?
Yeah, no. That's why I said Rabbeinu Tam. These are the great figures. Rabbeinu Tam, the Maram Rutenberg, the Rosh, also the Or Zarua, very much also Talmud of the Maram Rutenberg, embraced the idea of Eid Echad L'Sayea Potem and Ashvua, whereas in Provence was split, but the Ravid very adamant against, and most of Chachmei Sfarad were against. The truth is, the Rambam's view is interesting because it's not 100% clear. It's in the Ravid read the Rambam or accused the Rambam, of thinking that Eid Echad L'Sayea is Potem and Ashvua. In Perek Chaf, Hilchos Mechira, Halacha Dalet, Halacha that we read last time. I don't think there's, and it's interesting. The Ravid read it in the Rambam that way, and so did the Magid Mishnah. The Ksos HaChoshen, I think correctly, says there's nothing in the Rambam that really has to be read that way. And if you ask me, and others have made this point as well, if you look at Pirush Mishnayos, the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, in the beginning of Bava Metzia, it actually seems to be that he holds that the Rambam is not Potem and Ashvua.
Not that obvious what the Rambam's position is.
Not so obvious. It's debated. In my opinion, he doesn't believe in Eid Echad L'Sayea Potem and Ashvua, but it's not. Definitely, the Ravid thought he did, and definitely
looks like the sides have been picked between Ashkenaz and Sfarad on this
well,
issue.
again, the Rambam could be a maverick.
It could be a coincidence, but it definitely is lining up that way.
Yeah, 100%. So anyway, what I want to zero in on before we leave is one more point, and that is the strongest proof of the Ramban and the Rosh's rejection of it, because this is really goes to the heart of it in a way, and to the heart of another matter. So look at the Ramban for a minute. Back in the Ramban. Ramban says you have to skip a few more lines. Again.
What page?
Page 4. Milchamos again.
We're still in the same Milchamos?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I want to skip a couple lines down more. Yeah. Okay. Let's do this. Yeah. Ve'ilu isa lahai milsa. This is 7 lines down from the top of the piece, right towards the end of that line. Ve'ilu isa laha milsa.
Ve'ilu isa laha milsa. Yeah, shomer.
It's always fascinating to read the actual words of the Rishonim, if you can. First of all, it's good. Yeah, you don't have to believe me when I tell you what they say. You can see for yourself. But it's also just the language and their ability to articulate, how they said things is just so interesting. These were master thinkers and master formulators. They were just, off the charts. Their talent in thinking and arguing and in writing and in clarifying and is just, it's always a master class, So everybody have it? V'ilu Isa?
Yes.
So Ilu Isa lahamilsa, Shomer Samasa Shomer Mai Chayiv. This is so interesting. So we have the law. Many of you remember from 6th grade or 7th grade or 5th grade, or they usually learn, I don't know, at least in my time, they learn hamafkid, parak hamafkid, when you're yeah, exactly. Some start with Edim, some start with hamafkid. So I don't know if they still do, but definitely in my day. So there's this one of the most famous, themes and most exciting topics when you're, a young fellow starting out in your Talmudic journey is the argument, the discussion of Shomer Shemasal Shomer. What is that? So again, we were talking about Shomer before. Let's say somebody has an object and they entrust that object, to be watched, by Reuven as an object, and he gives it to Shimon to watch. For whatever reason, Shimon doesn't want to, whatever it is, he hands it over to Levi, so that Levi will watch the object.
It may not be acceptable to Reuven.
So there's a debate in the Gemara whether, and then something happens, of course, to the object. If nothing happens to the object, it's all, no harm. What is it? No foul, no harm. Is that what they say? No harm, no foul. Whatever it is, some new expression, relatively.
Harm, no foul.
No harm, no foul. Okay, I'll take your word for it. So, what's the idea? If the object is intact, the owner might not be happy. But he gets his object back and everything is fine. Let's say the object doesn't come back, and let's say what happened, at least according to the claim of the Shomer, is something that would normally exempt him. Let's say, again, he was, I don't know, a Shomer Sachar, and it was struck by lightning. So normally, if we could demonstrate that he'd be patur, he'd be exempt. Right? However, there's a debate in the Gemara. Shomer, Shamatza l'Shomer. If one Shomer passes it on to another Shomer, Chayev or Patur. So the Gemara explains, why would it be Chayev? Because the owner says, listen, how would it be Patur? He'd have to take a shvuah. The Shomer has to take a shvuah to say it was hit by lightning. I did a good job. It wasn't my fault. Right? So the owner says, I didn't hire you, and I don't believe you, and I don't know you. And I don't have to accept your clarification. I want clarification from my Shomer, the person who I entrusted. He didn't call me up and say, do you mind if I hand this off to another Shomer? I didn't give him permission to do that initially. I gave him, right, the job, and he accepted it to be the Shomer. So if he wants to tell me what happens, what happened to the object, then, I'm bound to accept his shvua and his explanation. But if he doesn't know, and he's just telling me that I have to hear it from a third party who I have no relationship to, right? I'm not obligated. Says the Ramban. So why really? So that's the pshat. Why is it that shomer shemasel shomer is chayiv? Because the Rishon, right, the one who he entrusted, is obligated to take a shvua. He owes the owner a shvua. He can't take that shvua because he doesn't really know directly what happened. That's called mitoch she'eno yachal lisha. That's another principle that we know of from the Gemara and Shavuos. And at Balbasra and many places, mitoch she'eno yachal lisha, since he can't swear, mishalim. Why can't he swear? Because the other guy says, you can't swear you don't know, and I'm not taking his shvua because I don't know him and I don't trust him. Says the Ramban, right? V'im kedivrei balachibur hazeh liftorhu. Only komakom be'edachad hu lo potter shomer rishon afagav di'u lo toin bari shalametzu b'pshia kivin sheish edachad ena mechuyev shvua klal. The Ramban says brilliantly. He says if it were really true that edachad misayeya, that an advocate aid, right, was able to exempt from a shvua, why is this mitoch sheni chalishav mishalim? Why not say the shomer, Sheni, Levi, right, who received the object from the first shomer, let him be an Eid Echad, and let him say, as an Eid Echad, I'm telling you what happened, and Eid Echad Messiah is Pater Min HaShua. So you wouldn't get Shomer Shemasel Shomer Chayiv because of Mitok Sheni Chalishav Mishalim. There wouldn't be a Chayiv Shvua.
That the nature of this transaction precludes that, because as a shomer he had an obligation. Shol shalach bayad, he had an obligation that he's not supposed to touch it, not supposed to do anything with it. Once he crossed that line, he's dead. But
it's not shlichus yad, as I say. If there was, it's mitol sheni cholok shavam b'shalim. He says, this is the language of the Gemara in Bab Metzia later in the Mafkin. It says, at mehemnesli b'shvua, heich lo mehemnesli b'shvua. Meaning, I have a relationship with you, I entrusted you explicitly and implicitly, I have to believe you. But I don't know him, I don't have a kesher with him.
But because of that, we can't use this as a klal of any sort, because it is a special relationship, this shomer. So we can't.
No, but the point is that this fellow still knows what happened to the object. So he says, why should he have to, let me put it this way. If there was evidence of what happened to the object, there wouldn't be a shvua.
But you just said the answer before, that he's saying, no, I don't have to accept anything from this party because you're the one person.
I don't have to accept his shvua, but he's not less than an Eid Echad. And if Eid Echad Messiah is poter and a shvua, these are two different legal ideas. I don't have to accept his shvua, but he can exempt the shomer rishon from a shvua, in which case there's no mitoch sheni chalishav mishalim. So now look at the Rush. This is a fascinating question. Now look what the Rush doesn't quote the Ramban here. You're quite right. Historically, the Rush was familiar, doesn't always quote the Ramban either, but often quotes the Ramban because the Rush was a contemporary of the Rajba, by the way.
But younger.
The Talmud of the Ramban.
But he was younger than the Rashba. No?
No, I think they're about the same ages, I think. But he was in Toledo. The Rosh was really in Ashkenaz.
Because the Rashba passed away before him.
Before the Rosh? I'm not sure. I have to check that. But the Rosh and the Rashba pretty much were contemporaries. The Rosh moved from Ashkenaz. That's all a very fascinating thing about the Rosh. He moved from Ashkenaz to Spain, but he settled in Toledo. And the Rajba was in Barcelona. Okay, the Rajba is considered, one of the two biggest students of the Ramban. The Ramban had, his two greatest, the Ra and the Rajba, yeah, who themselves got into a lot of dust-ups, I guess you would say. So now go back to the Rush for a minute. I'm going to try to make it quick, but this is really Very crucial. So look at the Rush. This is on page 3. 1 second. He doesn't quote the Ramban, maybe because he doesn't want to be, explicitly harsh. But the way that he characterizes his question is harsh. So I'm going to tell you how many lines from the top. 1 second. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, like 19 lines down from the top of the page.
Which page?
Page 3. If you go down 19 lines, it's worth it. It'll be worth the trouble.
What word?
So the first word on the line is de'ain. De'ain hashol yodea heich mesa.
Yeah, right. Got it. Yeah.
Okay, so this is what I want. This is what we're up to. V'yesh makshin hevel. That's pretty nasty, right? Or sharp.
Nonsense.
Right? Meaning some people ask an empty question, like, a ridiculous question. Who's he referring to? Here, the Ramban. That's probably why he doesn't want to, quote him. He says, but he dismisses the question. But you'll see why in a minute. You recognize it? That's Ramban's question. Why is Shomer Shemasal Shomer Chayiv? The Amarle says to him, as I quoted before, the Ramban didn't quote it, but the At Mehemeli B'Shvua, right? I believe you when you take a Shvua, but hey, Chlo Mehemeli B'Shvua. I don't believe him. I don't have to believe him. I don't have to know that he's a liar, by the way. Just that I didn't sign up to believe him. V'amai Chayiv. Why does that then turn the inability of the Rishon to take a Shvua? B'tok sheni kol shavam b'shalem chayiv. Why? Amai chayiv yiftarena shomar sheni. Let the second shomer save him, not by a shvua, but they do so by being an eidachad messiah, right? Who in turn exempts him mishvuasa shu chayiv. Sounds like a pretty good question to me. Listen to the Rosh's answer. The lo kasha midi. This is not a question at all. The chiyuve de rishon b'shvil de ein yochal shavahu. The first guy is chayiv, true, because he can't take a shvua. V'hu ein rotza laham in the shvuas hasheni, and the owner is not willing to accept the shvua from the second fellow. Therefore, the result of that, says the Rush, is that this is no longer a chiyuv shvua. Since there's a moment in which he can't take the shvua, the chiyuv shvua morphs into a chiyuv mamon. That's what mitok she'en yachal l'shavam b'shalem means. It doesn't mean, if in the end you can't take the shvua and there's nothing to do, then you're going to have to, open up your wallet. Says the Rosh, that's not the pshat. If that were the pshat, the Ramban would be right. And that is, if there's another way to exempt him from the shvua, then even though the exemption ends up saving him money, right, that's really bakifin. That's really indirectly, because really, he owes him a shvua, doesn't owe money. Just if he can't give him a shvua, he has got to give him the money. Says the Rosh, that's not really what's happening. Really what's happening is he can't give him a shvua, and therefore he owes him money. Not as a cover. Meaning, the chiyuv shvua is a p'tur mamon to begin with. If he can't provide it, then he really owes money. Isn't that it morphs into a chiyuv mamon? It's a chiyuv mamon which you could get rid of with the shvua, and if you don't take the shvua, then you're back to the chiyuv mamon. Eidacham Messiah is not poter mi mamon. V'nischayiv lo rishon mamon. The ein eidachad poter mi chiyuv mamon. So this is a fascinating thing. This is a major argument, and there are many, many echoes of this, both in the Rishonim and then later in Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim, especially in Siman Pei Zayin, Siman Ayin Hey. This principle of Mitok She'ena Yachal Ishava, Mishalim. I always give it as a mashal a little bit. I mean, there are two ways to understand the complicated relationship between shvua and mammon. One way to understand it is that really, whenever you're obligated to take a shvua, you're really obligated to pay. And the shvua is an out clause. It's a patur. We gave you the benefit of, you really owe money, but you want to get out of the, monetary obligation, you can save the day with a shvua. But then when you can't be nishba, it's really a chiyuv mamo. Right? That's one way to look at it. The opposite.
Like they get out of jail card.
Yeah, it's a get out of jail card. The opposite way to look at it, I always give this as my, what I call my taxi cab, but it's becoming obsolete because now all you can pay the cab, with a credit card, right? Or you don't even do that. If you take the Uber, it's like on the account. But back in the day when there were cabs, I think there still are cabs, and you pay in cash. So you're driving in a cab. This is always my mashal for this. You're driving in a cab, and it's time to get out, and you owe him base $16, right? And you reach into your pocket, and you only have a $20 bill. You only owe him $16, and of course he tells you that he doesn't carry any cash, right? So what happens?
He has to pay the.
You say, I'm not going to give you anything because you can't give me cash. So usually what happens is you got to give him the $20 bill. You don't owe him $20, you owe him $16. But if you can't give him the $16, then you're going to have to give him $20. So that's mitov. That's a perspective on mitov she'enichol l'shavam mishalim. You only owe him a shvua. You don't ever owe him more than a shvua, but you have to give him a shvua. And if you can't, it's not that you owe mammon and you can get away with a shvua, and therefore if you're not actually exercising that beneficial option, so you're back to square one and you owe him the money. That's how the Rosh is reading the principle. So the Rosh says, you want an Eid Echad to be poter. In that case, you're really asking an Eid Echad, Nisayeh, to be poter mimammon, and you can't do that. But the Ramban's saying that's not the pshat. The pshat is you owe him $16. He doesn't have change, meaning you owe him a shvua and you can't give it to him. But you have to give him something. You're not going to give him nothing. So the best thing you can give him is money. You don't owe him money, but in lieu of the shvua that you can't give him, you're going to give him something worth more, not worth less. But is it a chiyuv shvua or is it a chiyuv mamon? It's a chiyuv shvua. So the Ramban, if Eid Echad was really Messiah, if Eid Echad Messiah was really poter and a shvua, right? Then why would Shomer Shemasol the Shomer be chayiv? You have an Eid Echad Messiah. It's mitov she'enichol l'shavam mishalim. Yeah, but even if it's mitov she'enichol l'shavam mishalim, it's still a chiyuv shvua. Just that you can't pay him the $16, you're going to have to pay him the $20. You have to pay him the money. But if you have another way to exempt him, not from the money, but from the shvua, then that's fine. Okay, so what I want to pick up next time, I want to speak about one more case, and then we'll move on to the next Gemara. And that is the Ran, and the Mukei Yosef and the Ran have a major chiddush. I'm just going to tell you what it is, and then we'll talk about it next week. And that is as follows. They say, you know what, we have this major debate, right? Whether or not Eid Echad B'Sayeh exempts from a Shvua Daraisa, yes or no. However, maybe you should distinguish between different Shvuos Daraisa. So I'm going to speak about that broadly for a few minutes, even though it's massive. But I'm going to speak a little bit. But specifically what the Ran speaks about is the following. He says, let's say you have a Chiyuv Shvuas Eid Echad. Everybody agrees that an Eid Echad is Mechayiv Shvua, right? That's our background. Is there a difference between Eid Echad Messiah being poter from a Shvuas, from a Chiyuv Shvuas Eid Echad, or from a Chiyuv Shvuas Moed B'Miktzas and Shomrin? Or not? Does it matter that they're both Eid Echads? Maybe they could just cancel each other out. Maybe you don't really need him to exempt him in that case. All you need is for each one to knock the other one out of contention as a force. So that's what I want to talk about next. That's a really interesting question. And a little bit in light of what you asked about Shavuos HaShomer, I want to talk about the Ksosa's view of Shavuos HaShomer a little bit, and then we will move on to the issues of Moed B'Miktsas, starting from Gimel Amud Aleph, going through Dalet Amud Beis. Okay.
Okay, Shkach, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, I think we're fine going forward. If there are changes in schedule, I'll let
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay, thank you.